Welcome back to Next Practices. Today I'm talking with Page Keller, Vice President of Academic Relations at Knack and former president of the College Reading and Learning Association, who spent 25 years inside institutions before spending the years since studying support patterns across hundreds of campuses. In this episode, we get into what shifting from being inside one campus to being able to view hundreds of campus revealed to Paige that she couldn't see from the inside. The difference between institutions making incremental adjustments to protect the current model versus those who are actually redesigning around how students live now. Why misalignment shows up in transfer patterns and stop out behavior, not because students lack ability, but because the structure doesn't fit, and how you get leadership to accept that framing under pressure to show results fast. What peer learning looks like when it's built in from the start, not bolted on as a last resort, and the one concrete step that Paige tells provosts and VPs of student affairs to take first. But before we dive in, take a moment to subscribe to the show to stay up to date on the latest data-informed practices to drive institutional impact. Paige, thank you so much for joining me on Next Practices. I'm so excited to talk with you today.
It's so nice to see you, Katy. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'd love to get started by having you introduce yourself a little more to our audience, if you don't mind telling a little about yourself and the work that you've done to support and serve higher ed over the course of your career.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I am Paige Keller. I am the Vice President of Academic Relations at a company called Knack, Knack. And no, it doesn't stand for anything. It's like you have a knack for something, a knack for tutoring. Before joining the team at Knack, I spent 25 years on a college campus, all under the umbrella of academic affairs and in areas focused on student success and learning assistance and the first and second year experience and peer education. So a lot of my career has been really centered on one question, and that's how do we create the conditions that help more students succeed? Just a little more about my background when I was working on that college campus and it's crazy to think about almost 3 decades. I was really able to see that question up close and through individual students and the systems and the structures that they had to navigate. So now in my role at Knack, I've really had the opportunity to look at many of those same challenges across institutions and think a lot more broadly about what we could do differently to better serve students.
And that's where I'd love to start our conversation is unpacking those almost 3 decades of inside institutions, watching students navigate support systems firsthand, and
Mhm.
then now seeing those same patterns play out across hundreds of campuses.
Yeah.
What does that vantage point now, kind of outside looking in, reveal that you couldn't see when you were inside one institution?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When you work in one institution for so long, you become so very focused on solving those problems that are just right in front of you, directly in front of you. You know your students and you know your policies and your programs and the institutional culture, and you're constantly asking, how do we make this work better for our students? But what I can see now from, I think, that much broader vantage point that you asked about is how systemic many of the challenges really are. The same conversations are happening across higher education, and you see it all the time too, Katy. Institutions are wrestling with the same things, no matter where they are: engagement and retention and belonging, academic support, and then how to reach students who might be working or commuting or caring for family members or balancing responsibilities that don't really fit neatly into what we have always thought of as the traditional college experience. And I guess that what's become much clearer to me is that we have, and I see this again across the country when I'm talking with folks, is that we often ask students to adapt to systems that were designed for a very different student population. Maybe they, on the surface, mirror that traditional college student, that typical 18 to 22-year-old college student who's living on campus. It might mirror some of that, but these students are different now. And then when the students don't engage with those same systems in ways that we expect, we sometimes interpret that as a lack of motivation or a lack of engagement. And when you start seeing that same pattern from institution to institution, you start asking a different question. Instead of asking, why aren't students using what we've built? We really should be asking, have we built something that actually works for the students we have today? So I think that's the shift in perspective that's really important, because once you see the problem as structural rather than individual, the solutions you consider become very, very different.
Yeah, it's so powerful. But when you're inside an institution, I have a similar trajectory. Longtime listeners of the show know I worked in higher ed myself in student success, and often was facing those individual, like institutional challenges of how can we get students to engage more? How can
Mhm.
we make sure that students are coming to advising appointments and registering on time and all those questions? And it's difficult to see not only the systemic barriers within the institution, but that these aren't just institutional policy or institutional patterns like specific to that institution, but there are broader structural barriers or cultural barriers or shifts in evolution in learning that from it's hard to see unless you can pattern match across experiences.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, so true.
Yeah. In a recent LinkedIn post, you made a pretty pointed distinction between institutions making sort of incremental adjustments to address this shift in students by preserving the dominant model at the heart of things, versus those institutions that are actually redesigning around how students live now. What does
Mhm.
that redesign actually look like in practice? And how rare is it? What are you seeing kind of shift in higher ed to address this gap that you are observing?
Okay, those are good questions. I think incremental change is when we take the structure we already have and try to make it a little more flexible. Maybe we extend hours, or maybe we add an online option, or maybe we create another program or resource. And those things they can absolutely be valuable, but the underlying model really hasn't changed. So redesign starts really with a different question. So instead of asking, how do we get more students to use the systems we already have, we should be asking, if we were designing this around the lives of our students today, what would it look like? And that really means thinking about when students need support, where they need it, and how quickly can they access it, and whether they even know how to navigate whatever institutional structures we've created. It also means that flexibility isn't just about offering something online or opening up more weekend hours. It's really about reducing friction, and it's about meeting students where they are and integrating support into their experience in college rather than expecting them to find it after they encounter some sort of problem. So I do think a true redesign is still relatively rare. And I see this again when I talk with campuses across the country, because higher ed is built around these deeply established structures. Institutions are also under this enormous pressure to improve outcomes quickly with limited resources. I mean, that's top of mind for everyone. So that incremental change that I was talking about earlier, just making slight adjustments to existing structures, it can feel more achievable on the surface. But I'm always really encouraged by institutions that are willing to question some of those assumptions. The most interesting work I see is happening at institutions that aren't simply asking how to improve an existing program. They're asking whether the way they've structured support still makes sense for the students they serve.
I love that. It's a paradigm shift. It's thinking, it's like breaking out of those thought patterns and norms and trying to kind of rethink the system itself versus working within the constraints of the existing system and just trying new best practices, right? It's trying to invent
Right.
and innovate new ways of working that align with the needs of the students at your institution, which is daunting, but I think there's so much opportunity there to really start to think creatively and evolve the experience of higher
And it's
education.
kind of fun.
Yeah.
And of course, you have to think, what if money were not an issue? You almost have to start with that framework. And it's fun to do that because it's fun to think, what if I won the lottery, even though I don't play it? What if we have, what if I had unlimited funding? If I were to start fresh right now for our students right now, what would I do? And that's kind of a fun thing to think about, right?
Yeah, it's really fun. And it's that there's a convergent versus divergent thinking, like being able to think without barriers, you're going to yield more creativity, more creative ideas versus only having ideas generated based on the constraints that you have right now, which are going to
Mhm.
limit you and put you in just like slightly more creative variations of
Right.
what you're already thinking about. I don't know. This is an older book, but it's Originals by Adam Grant.
Mhm.
Talks about this concept that folks who come up with original ideas, more creative solutions, are often primed to be more creative. They're primed outside of the existing barriers and can see solutions outside of the system. And oftentimes when you're in the system or in a culture, your creative thinking becomes limited by those
Mhm.
constraints, and you are going to have more derivative ideas.
I'm
This is
so
really
glad you
fascinating.
brought that book up. Yeah, great, great example there.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to, like, in the same like direction of this conversation, I want to talk like a little bit more granularly about like how this plays out. So you wrote that misalignment shows up in transfer patterns and stop out behaviors, in disengagement, which we've already touched on, not because students lack ability, but because the structure doesn't fit their lives. And you alluded to this in the introduction of this episode. That's a significant reframe from how institutions tend to assign blame. Like, we often think like students are disengaged, they must be out, partying or whatever assumptions we make. And we don't
Mhm.
think about like the constraints on the student. So how do you get institutional leaders to accept this shift in framing, especially when the pressure is to show results fast, and there might be some hesitation around experimenting because they're afraid to risk the loss of time?
Yeah. Yeah, fear is a big thing. And I think really that goes right along with the first thing to acknowledge with institutional leaders is that they're under a tremendous amount of pressure. So they're being asked to improve retention and completion and address these access gaps and respond to enrollment challenges and manage budgets or lack thereof and demonstrate results. We've got to assess and we have to demonstrate results and all of this at the same time. So I don't really think it's about telling institutions that everything they've been doing is wrong. It's about helping leaders look differently at the data and the student experience behind that data. So if a student stops out or transfers and disengages, we tend to focus on that outcome. But obviously, what we need to be asking is what happened before that outcome? Where in the student's journey was the friction? What barriers did that student encounter? And I'll just because this is the world that I live in now, academic support and earning opportunities. Was the student unable to get to the learning center when the learning center was open, or meet online with the tutor when the one tutor for that course was available? Or is the student looking for a job, but every job on their campus in this small town is between the hours of 8 and 5, and they're in classes then, so they need something outside of that. So are we creating flexibility? So what are the barriers that the student encountered? And were there points where the support did exist, but like I said, wasn't accessible at the moment when students need it. And I think that's where qualitative information becomes very important alongside that institutional data. You got to talk to students. You have to ask them to describe what it actually feels like to navigate your institution. This is not something that you can get from a survey. Students aren't going to spend enough time completing the fillable form in a survey. You need to sit down with students and ask them, what did it feel like when you needed help but couldn't access it? Or what did it feel like when you needed to talk to somebody in this office and they were closed by the time you got out of classes and work? Describe that to us. And the other place that redesign doesn't necessarily, another place or another piece of the puzzle, I guess, is that redesign doesn't necessarily mean waiting 5 years to see results. There are opportunities to identify specific friction points and make targeted changes while still pursuing a longer term strategy. It's that microscope, telescope ideal where you always are looking through the telescope. Like you're looking at the big picture, you're looking far into the distance, but you also are microscopic. You're looking at the little things that are happening on campus and getting down into the weeds and into into those into the details and making changes now that will impact what's happening far down the road. So ultimately, I think leaders are more receptive to this framing when it moves us from asking what's wrong with the student, as I've been saying, and toward asking what can we change about the environment around the student to give them a better opportunity to succeed.
Yeah. And if with that in mind, if institutions were actually designing support around how today's students live, what would that redesign look like? What might, for example, peer learning look like instead? Or what other kinds of things are people trying or doing to kind of embrace this in kind of incremental, small, targeted
Okay,
ways?
that's a good question too. I think a lot of times when people think about student support and getting help and and considering using peer learning, we often think, well, it's the students who are struggling. But I think we have to really move away from the idea that peer learning is a remedial intervention. Peer learning can be an incredibly powerful part of that educational experience. And I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself. I hope I'm answering the question that
No,
you.
you are.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
yeah, you are. Yeah.
Peer learning can be an incredibly meaningful part of the educational experience. We work closely with Dr. George Koo, and if you've ever heard of high impact practices, then you know that Dr. Koo literally wrote the book on high impact practices. And he is our senior advisor at our company, and he and I often talk about these educationally purposeful peer interactions and how they uh, they make an impact not only to the students on the receiving end, but also to the student delivering that support. And it doesn't have to be when a student is already struggling. It can be proactive. It can be embedded into courses and into academic pathways, and it can be available. It should be available at times when the student actually needs it. And it can become part of the culture of how students learn at an institution. It was Alexander Aston who said, and I'm going to absolutely massacre this quote. Give me like 5 seconds and I could probably find it, but it's the peers themselves are the most influential relationship a student is going to have on a college campus. Again, that is not word for word. It's actually quite a word jumble of the Aston quote, but the most the most impactful relationship a student is going to have is with other students, is with another student or other students. Um, Peer educators themselves, peer tutors, peer supplemental instruction leaders, peers in the residence halls, they're developing these communication skills and leadership skills, problem solving, interpersonal skills, all of those NACE competencies that we're always thinking about, like what the peers are getting out of it. So the student providing that support is having such a meaningful educational experience, and in many cases reinforcing their own subject matter knowledge while also helping another. And it creates this sense of belonging for both students that can't be replicated in any other way than through this shared peer-to-peer learning. So I think when we think about peer learning more broadly, it becomes more than an SI program or a tutoring program or a peer mentoring program. It can become part of an institution's strategy around student success and belonging and engagement and even career readiness.
Yeah, it makes so much sense that there's just like so many opportunities to get outside of our formal frameworks and to kind of think about on a very simple level, like how does this work human to human? And I think right now, especially, those are sometimes very accessible solutions that we can start to leverage. There are solutions that are right in front of us that sometimes we can leverage. And I think having data, starting from a place of not only, I love what you said about looking at the data, but then also having qualitative input, and that qualitative input cannot just be surveys, that you actually have to have human connection and conversations, because you're not going to get the context you really need from a form fill. Any marketer knows that the conversion on forms is terrible the more you ask people to fill out. So you want forms to be really simple and low friction. So I think that that makes a lot of sense, and it gets us thinking about, getting into those relational pieces. The one of the beautiful pieces about being part of a college campus is being in relationship with the human beings that are there. It's a really important piece of that puzzle.
And the reach is so far. If I am a student who is not really making that many connections on campus, and maybe I haven't found my fit, it kind of goes back to one of your earlier questions, but I haven't really found my fit. I haven't found my place on campus. And I'm struggling in a course, and maybe I go to a supplemental instruction session, or I reach out to a peer tutor, or I call into, although this would be anonymous, but I call into the peer counseling center. I mean, any kind of peer-to-peer connection starts to make them feel more connected. It makes them feel more connected to another person on campus, and by default, another center or area on campus. And maybe the peer tutor suggests to the student, okay, so after we meet today, I really want you to go into your professor's office hours, and I want you to talk with the professor about these three things that we discussed today, to dig a little bit deeper into this concept. I'm trying to speak in vague terms right now. Um, and so maybe that pushes the student to actually go meet with the professor. And that's one of the things we measure, right? Like on the NESI survey, for example, we want to know how often do you have one-on-ones or communicate, I can't remember the exact question, with faculty or administrators on campus. And like it's like a ripple out effect. Make that one connection with that one peer, and you don't have any idea just how far that ripple will go on campus.
Yeah, it's really can be very powerful, that point of connection. Well, as we wrap up our conversation, I just have one more question for you. If you were talking to a provost or VP of student affairs that's listening to this conversation, what is, one concrete step toward closing that gap that we've been discussing between how their institution is structured and how their students actually live, that it suggests that they take?
Okay. I think that the administrator would probably roll their eyes when I tell them this, but I would, especially if it's a provost, but I think this would be a really good practice. I would tell them to pick one part of the student experience and try to navigate it exactly the way the student has to. So don't look at the process map. Don't look at the organizational chart. Just experience the process. All right. So let's say this. Let's say that I'm a student who realizes at 9 p.m. at night that I'm struggling in my chemistry class. And so I'm the provost, I'm the associate VP, I'm the EVP of student affairs. What happens next? Do I know where to go? Let's say that I'm a first year student. Do I know where to go? Can I find the information easily? Is support available when I need it? Or at least can I schedule it? Like in that moment, if I'm saying, oh my God, it's 9 p.m., I need help in the morning, or I need help before the end of the day tomorrow, can I schedule it? How many steps does it take for me to get the help I need? How many offices or systems do I have to navigate? And what happens if I'm working tomorrow during the hour or in classes during the hours when that support is available? And so try to navigate it yourself and then ask the students the same question. And I think leaders could learn a lot about this by identifying those moments of friction
Mhm.
between what an institution provides and what a student can realistically access. And I would start small again, just find one place where students are being asked to figure things out around the institution rather, or I guess, figure, find a place where students are being asked to work around the institution rather than the institution working around them and fix that. I mean,
Yeah,
because
that's so
ultimately, yeah,
smart.
I think the goal is, I always think this, it's not to offer more resources. Most institutions already offer a ton of resources. The goal is really to create an environment where students can actually access and benefit from those resources in ways that fit their lives.
I love that exercise. And I know it's a little bit cheeky, but it's so true and so simple and such a simple way to place to start. And I think even at the very highest levels, provost, but I think even an advisor doesn't always have, and they're closer to it, but it's a good practice no matter where your vantage point is to understand like what that looks like for the student and how they're navigating through that and where it's muddy and where things are opaque and where things don't make sense to them because they haven't like functioned in this system is so I used to liken it and I've used this analogy before is like high school and college seem similar, but high school is like playing checkers and college is like playing chess. The boards kind of look the same and they have the pieces start in the same place. And but if you apply the rules of checkers to chess, you're not gonna win. And I think this kind of starts to reveal some of those differences in the games.
It does. And I think there is, on a college campus, there is a massive difference between saying you have a student support system or having whatever student support system we've always done it this way, and building a system that truly supports students.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to stop on that note because I think that was a perfect closing remark. Paige,
Okay.
thank you so much for coming on Next
Yeah,
Practices. I've enjoyed our conversation.
I have enjoyed it also. Thank you so much for having me.